Civil War from the Confederate Perspective. On April 12, 1861, the forces of the newly established Confederate States of America commenced hostilities against Fort Sumter. With each artillery shell that struck the fort's deteriorating structure, the divisions that had long been festering within American society were forcefully transformed into vast rifts. For the Confederates engaged in rebellion, the resounding cannon fire heralded a noble second struggle for independence. To the global audience, however, the American Civil War had officially commenced, with the Confederacy delivering the initial assault. The accuracy of intelligence, or the absence thereof, played a significant role in the military strategies employed by commanders on both sides during the Civil War. Throughout the 19th century, affluent Southerners in America had developed a highly lucrative economic framework centered around cotton exports. This vital crop, essential to the industrializing world, consistently increased in value, positioning the American South as the fourth wealthiest economy globally. However, this prosperity was fundamentally supported by the enslavement of millions of Black Americans. Without the institution of slavery, the affluent lifestyle of many Southern elites would collapse into devastation. Consequently, they were determined to safeguard slavery at any cost. The South's intense focus on this institution increasingly set them at odds with their Northern counterparts, who began to view slavery with growing skepticism. Some radical individuals in the North even initiated discussions regarding a nationwide prohibition or abolition of slavery. For the slave-dependent South, this prospect was utterly alarming. Every stratum of Southern society had a vested interest in maintaining the institution of slavery. In the Southern states, 25% of all white families owned slaves, with even higher ownership rates in the lower South. For these families, the end of slavery would spell economic disaster. Additionally, impoverished Southerners were staunchly opposed to abolition, as slavery represented the sole barrier between them and the lowest echelons of Southern society. White Southerners harbored significant fears that the abolition of slavery would precipitate a catastrophic race war. Consequently, the anti-slavery sentiments prevalent in the North were perceived not only as a threat to their economic interests, but also as a social affront and a violent challenge to their way of life. Alarmingly, as opposition to slavery intensified in the North, the influence of the South began to diminish. The influx of immigrants had resulted in a demographic surge in the North, which proportionately diminished the political clout of the Southern states. Additionally, Northern industries, financial institutions, and merchants increasingly monopolized trade with the South, posing a serious threat to the agrarian economy of the region. This led many Southerners to express concerns about their perceived subservience to Northern interests. In order to maintain their political dominance, the South sought new allies and recognized the necessity of expanding slavery. As the United States moved westward, Southern leaders insisted that the newly acquired territories be opened to the institution of slavery. This demand was met with strong opposition from Northerners, particularly from the newly established Republican Party, which advocated for the containment of slavery within its current borders in the South. Moreover, Republicans aimed to hinder the return of escaped slaves to Southern states. By the 1850s, many Southerners viewed the Republican Party as a formidable adversary, derogatorily labeling them as Black Republicans. In an era marked by deep-seated racism, such a label was considered one of the gravest insults. After years of negotiations and compromises, tensions escalated dramatically in Kansas, where the question of slavery was controversially left to a local vote. Pro-slavery advocates from the South began migrating to Kansas with the intent of voting in favor of allowing slavery in the territory. These individuals were soon met by anti-slavery Northerners who had the opposite goal. This clash of interests quickly erupted into violent confrontations. As partisan newspapers incited their respective audiences, both factions committed escalating acts of violence, leading to the term Bleeding Kansas being used to describe the turmoil that ensued. In the rapidly intensifying Kansas conflict, a Northern abolitionist named John Brown emerged as a significant figure. A fervent adversary of slavery, Brown extended his ambitions beyond Kansas, forcefully invading Virginia in 1859 in an effort to provoke a slave insurrection. Although his endeavor ultimately resulted in his capture and execution, to many Southerners, this extreme form of abolitionism appeared to bring the nation to the precipice of racial catastrophe. The situation was further inflamed as the Northern populace regarded Brown as a martyr rather than a dangerous terrorist. With tensions running high, Southerners felt increasingly threatened by the anti-slavery movements in the North. This sense of unease escalated into panic with the Republican nomination of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. For years, the Republican Party had been vilified in the South as it sought to eradicate slavery through legislation, thus being perceived as a fundamental threat to the Southern way of life. Supporters of the Republican Party had committed heinous acts in Kansas and had celebrated John Brown's alarming raid, leading to the belief that they could not be permitted to occupy the White House. Despite being outnumbered, Southern votes were insufficient to halt the Republican momentum. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected as the 16th President of the United States, a scenario that Southern voters regarded as a nightmare. Southerners feared that Lincoln and his supporters would fill national offices with anti-slavery advocates, incite catastrophic slave revolts, devastate the Southern economy, and undermine Southern society. With the nation poised to be governed by a perceived radical who had not garnered a single electoral vote in the South, opposing politicians began to assert that the only means to ensure the honor, liberty, and safety of Southern whites was through secession. South Carolina was the first state to take action, officially seceding from the United States on December 20, 1860. In its justification for secession, South Carolina cited the growing animosity from non-slave-holding states towards the institution of slavery, as well as the election of a president whose views were perceived as antagonistic to slavery. Shortly thereafter, 6 additional states from the Lower South joined South Carolina, collectively establishing the Confederate States of America in February 1861. A month later, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as president of a nation divided. Wealthy Southerners argued that secession was a legitimate means to safeguard slavery. To quell any dissent against secession, opposition was suppressed, and the issue was not subjected to a popular referendum. While most residents of the Lower South quickly aligned with the secessionist cause, certain areas of the Upper South, which were less reliant on slavery, exhibited reluctance to depart from the Union. Nonetheless, these states firmly asserted that they would not tolerate any military action against their seceding counterparts. In their view, the responsibility now lay with Lincoln. The incident that ultimately ignited this political tension into full-scale war was the confrontation at Fort Sumter. This island fortress in South Carolina, manned by federal troops, had come under an informal siege by the newly formed Confederate Army. As supplies dwindled, Lincoln declared his intention to resupply the fort. This announcement was perceived by the Confederacy as a violation of their sovereignty. In response, Confederate President Jefferson Davis deemed it necessary to demonstrate military strength. On April 12, 1861, hostilities commenced. With the onset of war, 4 additional states rallied to the Confederate cause. Despite this, the Confederacy found itself at a significant disadvantage. In contrast to the Union's population of 20 million, the Confederacy had a mere 9 million inhabitants, nearly 4 million of whom were enslaved individuals. The industrial capacity of the South was significantly inferior, with Southern factories being outnumbered by a ratio of 10 to 1 compared to those in the North, producing 15 times less iron, 38 times less coal, and 32 times fewer firearms. Faced with such disparities in numbers and resources, it became evident to Southern leaders that achieving independence through sheer military force would be an insurmountable challenge. Nevertheless, the Confederacy initially regarded the North's advantages with a degree of indifference. They held a firm belief that European nations, particularly Britain and France, would come to their aid to safeguard their essential cotton supplies. Drawing inspiration from the American revolutionaries, Confederate strategists were convinced that by prolonging the conflict they could erode the morale of their adversaries and instigate political change. In the interim, the perceived military capabilities of white Southerners were thought sufficient to repel the supposedly weaker Northern forces. They believed that victory was merely a matter of time. Anticipating a brief conflict, Southern men enlisted in the Confederate Army for a multitude of interconnected reasons. After years of escalating tensions, many Confederates perceived Northern encroachments as a threat to vital elements of Southern life, including rural autonomy and the institution of slavery, which provided their families with a sense of freedom and stability. As local communities banded together to take up arms, many felt that their honor as men was tied to the act of fighting, although the ensuing 4 years would bring little honor amidst the darkness. Following some minor skirmishes with Northern troops in the summer of 1861, Confederate forces experienced their first significant engagement in July of that year near Manassas Junction, Virginia. In the midst of combat, General Thomas Jackson stood resolutely, earning the moniker Stonewall and averting a potential collapse of the Confederate forces. The engagement, known in the South as the First Battle of Manassas, concluded with a Confederate victory. However, it dispelled any notions that the conflict would be swift and devoid of bloodshed. As Union troops reorganized, the Confederacy extended its forces along the entire northern border, anticipating that its smaller armies could support one another in the event of a Union offensive. This approach, however, proved to be misguided. Union forces led by General Ulysses S. Grant triumphed over a smaller Confederate contingent at the Battle of Shiloh, and a series of Union victories in 1862 further fractured Confederate defenses in the West. Compounding the Confederacy's troubles, a Union fleet entered New Orleans, stripping the Confederacy of its largest city and vital seaport. In the Eastern Theater, the Confederacy faced near disaster when a Union army came perilously close to seizing Richmond, the Confederate capital. In response to this looming threat, President Davis appointed General Robert E. Lee to oversee the city's defense. Lee quickly achieved a series of victories, driving back the overly cautious Union forces and establishing himself as one of the Confederacy's most adept generals. In an effort to take the offensive, Lee initiated an invasion of Northern Territory in the autumn of 1862. He made the risky decision to divide his forces, leaving some under Stonewall Jackson's command while he pressed further north. This choice nearly led to catastrophe when Lee's invasion plans inadvertently fell into the hands of a nearby Union army that outnumbered him significantly. Fortunately, the Northern commanders delayed their advance just long enough for Lee to consolidate the majority of his remaining troops near Sharpsburg, Maryland, where he prepared to make his stand. The Battle of Sharpsburg commenced on September 17, 1862. Union forces launched a series of fragmented assaults against the Confederate lines, failing to capitalize on their significant numerical advantage. Despite this, Confederate troops managed to hold their ground, though they faced overwhelming casualties, and the core of their army was perilously close to collapse. As the battle raged on throughout the day, the arrival of reinforcements from the South marked the conclusion of what would become the bloodiest day in American history. While the Battle of Sharpsburg was tactically inconclusive, General Lee's battered forces were soon compelled to retreat into Confederate territory. This setback was particularly disheartening for white Southerners, as it provided President Abraham Lincoln with the assurance needed to announce his Emancipation Proclamation, which aimed to abolish slavery in the Confederacy. For the anti-slavery factions among the Confederacy's potential European allies, this proclamation was a significant development. Neither Britain nor France would openly support slavery or the Confederacy's quest for independence, leaving the South's most viable route to victory in tatters. Despite the grim outlook, the Confederacy continued to thwart Northern efforts to conclude the war. In the West, Union troops led by Ulysses S. Grant made progress down the Mississippi River, but were hindered by the Confederate forces defending Vicksburg. In the East, Lee achieved a decisive victory against a larger Northern force at Fredericksburg and executed a brilliant maneuver at Chancellorsville. Though mourning the loss of Stonewall Jackson, Lee felt emboldened to initiate a new invasion of the North in the summer of 1863. In early June, his troops crossed into Pennsylvania, commencing their offensive against Northern territories. Riding high on their recent successes, Confederate soldiers exhibited a sense of confidence bordering on arrogance. On July 1st, near Gettysburg, Confederate morale was bolstered when they defeated a smaller contingent of Union forces. However, General Lee miscalculated the strength of the Union troops in the vicinity and soon found himself outnumbered in what would become the most lethal battle of the war. With Union soldiers entrenched on the heights south of Gettysburg, Lee sought to penetrate the Northern lines and secure a decisive victory. On July 2nd, Confederate troops engaged in fierce fighting against the Union flanks, which faltered but did not collapse. In pursuit of a breakthrough, Lee directed his forces to focus on the Union center on July 3rd. Yet this effort also ended in failure. Although he inflicted significant casualties on his adversary, Lee's own forces suffered devastating losses, compelling him to retreat back into Confederate territory. The day following Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, Confederate forces at Vicksburg surrendered to General Grant, relinquishing control of the Mississippi River and effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. This defeat was particularly bitter, as Lee had declined to send reinforcements to the rapidly deteriorating Western theater, instead placing his hopes on his unsuccessful Northern invasion. The military situation for the Confederacy was becoming increasingly precarious. Beyond the front lines, the war was also having a profound impact. A tightening Union blockade severely hindered Confederate attempts to export cotton, while Southern politicians resisted implementing urgently needed tax increases. Consequently, inflation spiraled out of control. The ongoing conflict also significantly disrupted the institution of slavery, as numerous Black Americans seized their freedom. Inspired by the Emancipation Proclamation, and with cotton exports becoming increasingly difficult and the maintenance of slavery more challenging, the very foundations of the Southern economy were beginning to crumble. The economic hardships were felt most acutely by the poorest residents of the South. As the men were away engaged in combat, women in the Confederacy faced significant challenges in providing for their families, leading to widespread bread riots throughout the region. The food scarcity was further intensified by the imposition of an unpopular draft on white Southern men, while struggling farms were compelled to surrender 10% of their harvests to Confederate authorities. Despite this, many plantation owners managed to circumvent these regulations. Those affluent Southerners who had been the most vocal proponents of secession experienced the least hardship as a result, a reality that did not escape the notice of many Confederates facing adversity. As morale dwindled, instances of desertion increased. Concerned for their families, Confederate soldiers sought to return to their farms. This continuous depletion of manpower posed a significant challenge for the already outnumbered South. Some deserters even resorted to armed resistance against the Confederacy, engaging in guerrilla warfare within its own territory. Jefferson Davis endeavored to galvanize the Confederate populace, yet for some Southerners, the war for independence began to appear increasingly unwise. In the autumn of 1863, the Confederacy came close to securing a crucial victory in the problematic Western theater. A large Union army made the strategic error of splitting its forces, which provided the Confederacy with the chance to defeat the outnumbered Northern units individually. However, this opportunity was squandered by Confederate General Braxton Bragg, who, despite achieving a costly victory at Chickamauga, failed to leverage his position effectively. Union forces quickly regrouped and inflicted severe losses on Bragg's troops during the subsequent Chattanooga campaign. For many in the South, the setbacks at Chickamauga and Chattanooga marked a pivotal moment in the conflict. Following these events, one Confederate general noted that the enthusiasm of the Southern soldier was never again witnessed after Chickamauga. The once vibrant spirit that had characterized him was irretrievably lost. The inability to capitalize on previous successes was a devastating blow to his aspirations for an autonomous South. As the prospect of military triumph gradually diminished, the South could only wish for the North to grow weary of the conflict before they themselves did. Despite being outnumbered, Confederate forces continued to fight tenaciously. By this stage, the Union's numerical superiority was further enhanced by the enlistment of hundreds of thousands of black soldiers, whom the Confederates regarded with disdain. Confederate leaders consistently refused to acknowledge black soldiers as equal fighters, often resorting to enslaving them upon capture. In retaliation, Lincoln halted prisoner exchanges with the Confederacy, condemning numerous Confederate soldiers to prolonged confinement in deplorable POW camps. With each passing day, both factions grew increasingly inflexible. During the summer of 1864, a series of Union offensives in both the Eastern and Western theaters posed a significant threat to the Confederacy's existence. In Georgia, General William T. Sherman advanced relentlessly toward Atlanta, while General Grant initiated his overland campaign in Virginia. The Union suffered substantial casualties, and Confederates hoped that the Northern electorate would choose to replace Lincoln in the 1864 election, potentially bringing forth a new president open to negotiating peace. However, as Sherman's forces captured Atlanta in the autumn of 1864, Lincoln's popularity surged, ensuring his re-election. The Confederacy's final glimmer of victory faded away. As the brutal conflict continued, the South descended further into disorder. Following his conquest of Atlanta, Union General William T. Sherman launched a devastating campaign through Georgia that decimated what remained of the Southern economy. 1. The news of Sherman's relentless advance instilled fear across the South, likely exacerbating the increasing rates of desertion among Confederate troops. An attempt by the Confederacy to outmaneuver Sherman's forces resulted in the destruction of one of their largest armies, while the loss of fertile agricultural land severely hampered the South's capacity to sustain its remaining soldiers. Time was not on the Confederate side. In the Eastern Theater, although Lee had inflicted severe losses on Grant's forces as they moved into Virginia, his own troops had suffered significant casualties as well. Unlike the North, these Confederate losses were irreplaceable. Outnumbered, the Confederate soldiers soon found themselves encircled in Petersburg, a crucial supply center for Richmond. After enduring months of trench warfare, Lee ultimately commanded his forces to evacuate both cities in the spring of 1865. The Southern defeat followed swiftly after Lee's withdrawal from Petersburg. Cornered outside Appomattox Courthouse by a superior Union army, Lee was compelled to surrender on April 9, 1865. Shortly thereafter, all other major Confederate armies would also capitulate. The Confederacy's struggle for independence had concluded, yet the battle for its legacy was just beginning. From the war's outset, many Confederates held the belief that secession and the maintenance of slavery were essential for safeguarding the status, security, and dignity of their families. Ironically, the conflict ultimately dismantled the very society that Southerners sought to protect. As their familiar world crumbled around them, some Confederate soldiers intensified their commitment to the cause, perceiving their hardships as a consequence of Northern hostility. These sentiments persisted even as Confederate soldiers surrendered their arms and took humiliating oaths of loyalty to their Northern victors. Following a Southern defeat, the Republican-led Northern government intensified its dismantling of Southern slavery, granted voting rights to black men, and deployed occupation troops to ensure compliance from the South. For Northerners, this process was termed Reconstruction. Conversely, white Southerners perceived this as a degradation. With their aspirations seemingly extinguished, many white Southerners experienced profound shame that morphed into anger, prompting some former Confederates to align with extremist groups like the KKK. Although the South could not prevail in the war, it sought to influence the narrative of its aftermath. As Northern troops gradually withdrew and the South violently reinstated discrimination across society, a new interpretation of the Civil War began to take shape. In this retelling, the Confederacy was portrayed not as a secessionist entity aiming to uphold slavery, but as a defender of states' rights and a valiant opponent of Northern oppression. This narrative resonated with many Southerners, as it reflected their motivations while conveniently omitting the less honorable aspects of their cause. This perspective became ingrained in the upbringing of many in the South. However, no singular narrative can encapsulate the Confederate experience during the Civil War. Confederates were aware that their nation was established to maintain slavery and to safeguard the only lifestyle they had ever known. Many Southerners fought for the Confederacy with enthusiasm, while others grew disillusioned, and some viewed their struggle in more personal terms. As the conflict drew to a close, numerous Southerners found it challenging to adapt to a reality that was unwelcoming, striving to revert to their previous ways. These Confederates may not have been heroes, but they were individuals, and it is essential to remember them as such. Like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to support our community.